film being shown here is from a National Socialist propaganda film entitled Traitors Before the People's Court. The proceedings were filmed with a view to distributing the film at a later date, although the whole film remained unseen to the public until 1979. Parts of it were shown, however, before that date. The quality is poor, and the audio is difficult to hear, made all the more difficult for the sound engineers by the screaming of abuse at the defendants by Judge Roland Freisler. The traitors, as per the language used in the film, are those that tried to overthrow the National Socialist regime in the bomb plot and attempted coup of the 20th of July 1944. Whereas quite a lot is known about the judge, former communist turned National Socialist Roland Freisler, who escaped justice when he was killed in an air raid. This video will examine the fate of another of the National Socialist criminals, the lead prosecutor at the People's Court, and the prosecutor who spoke here. On the 14th of July 1934, in the building that had once housed the Prussian State Parliament, the judges of the National Socialist People's Court were sworn in. This body was designed to execute National Socialist justice and to protect that political system. It was due to have been sworn in 2 weeks earlier. However, the highest in the state were then occupied in the extrajudicial removal of what they considered to be their enemies in the Night of the Long Knives. The duty of the People's Court was to try what they termed treason. This was one of the very first demands of the National Socialist Party. Indeed, it even predated Hitler becoming a party member. A court above the normal courts of the land, a court which ruled to the whims of its political masters. The court was a major instrument of terror used to combat resistance to National Socialist rule. For the accused, there was no presumption of innocence. The defendant had few rights, including that of being able to choose a lawyer. A lawyer was appointed, sometimes only a few minutes before the case was to begin. Sometimes the lawyer would apologise to the court for having such a client and demand a severe punishment. Up until the collapse of the Third Reich, the People's Court passed around 5,200 death sentences for enemies of the regime. Death sentences were passed for a variety of offences, from those who attempted to overthrow the National Socialist regime on 20th of July 1944, to such things as listening to foreign radio broadcasts. On the 1st of July 1943, the People's Court had 47 professional judges and 95 honorary judges, including 30 officers, 4 police officers, and 48 various Nazi Party functionaries. It had 179 public prosecutors. Around 570 legal staff worked for the People's Court at one time or another. In 1943, of 3,338 cases brought before the court, 1,662 resulted in death sentences and only 123 people were found innocent. None of the prosecutors were ever charged in West Germany. Most of them even maintained their position in the justice system. Only one was charged by the Americans. He was the lead prosecutor in the National Socialist People's Court, a man called Ernst Lautz. Lautz was born on the 13th of November 1887 in Wiesbaden. After completing his legal examinations, Lautz went into the army during the First World War. In 1920 he became a public prosecutor in Neuwied, 12 kilometers northwest of Koblenz. In 1930 he moved to Berlin as the senior public prosecutor at a regional court. He was then a member of the German People's Party, Deutsche Volkspartei, the party of Gustav Stresemann. In Berlin, in 1936, he became a Generalstaatsanwalt, which is a prosecution supervisor. The word Generalstaatsanwalt in German is often translated as Attorney General, although in English-speaking countries this is a much higher office. In 1937 he was transferred to Karlsruhe. Lautz joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party in May 1933. His former party, the German People's Party, was dissolved on the 4th of July 1933 in order to protect the safety of its members at a time of increasing Nazi violence towards the opposition. He became a prosecutor at the People's Court on the 1st of July 1939. This would have been a promotion to him. Although still a civil servant, he was now also a party functionary. On the 23rd of April 1941, Victor Brack and Werner Haider spoke to the Reich Minister of Justice at a meeting of public prosecutors and presidents of the higher regional courts. Victor Brack was an economist and Werner Haider a psychiatrist, and both were higher functionaries in the Action T4 program, which murdered the physically and mentally challenged at various locations throughout Germany, such as at Grafenegg, shown here. Attendees at this meeting were privy to Hitler's letter from 1939 and told that the Führer had refused to pass a formal law on euthanasia for reasons of foreign policy. Lautz was present at the meeting and therefore became aware of the murder campaign being directed at the physically and mentally challenged. The fact that he was invited shows just how safe the Nazi murderers felt in his company and the trust in which they could share its secrets. Being aware of a murder campaign is of course not the same as complicity. However, Lautz was just as keen to kill what he considered the enemies of the National Socialist state. One of his victims was Edward Sachert. Born in 1881, he joined the post office where he worked until he went to the front during the First World War. After the war, he was elected to a local Berlin council and then to the Berlin City Council and also the Prussian State Parliament. After Nazi seizure of power, he was part of the Social Democratic underground. In 1934 he was arrested, severely beaten up and released 3 months later. He then worked as an insurance agent. In October 1942, Edward Sachert wrote to an innkeeper and warned him not to let his son become an officer. The innkeeper denounced him, whereupon he was arrested and put before the People's Court. He was charged with undermining military strength, a common charge which had a wide range of interpretations. Lautz demanded the death sentence, which was granted on the 30th of April 1943. It appears that both the SS and the Gestapo suggested clemency, but Lautz dismissed this. Edward Sachert was executed on the 22nd of July 1943 in Plötzensee prison. Lautz reported the killing to the Minister of Justice, Dr. Tirach. The execution went without incident. It took 14 seconds. Lautz represented the prosecution in the proceedings against those involved in the assassination attempt of the 20th of July 1944. He demanded the death penalty for them, which was granted. In this photograph, we can see him with Roland Freisler at the beginning of a session of the People's Court. To the right of Freisler is General Hermann Reinecke, head of the General Office of the Armed Forces in the OKW. In his opening argument, eyewitnesses reported that in his speech Lautz kept his hands dignified over his body like a pastor and always looked at the ceiling of the courtroom when he emphatically invoked God. It was a small circle of friendless scum who raised their hands against the Führer. A miracle of the Lord God saved the Führer for us. The defendants tried to gain control of the army and homeland by assassinating the Führer. This failed through God's blessing. One can only come to the conclusion that the punishment against the defendants must be death by hanging. Here we can see one of the victims of the court, Major General Helmut Stief. I'm currently preparing an account of his life and activities in the German resistance, and I'll publish that whenever I finish it. Lautz earned himself the nickname of Miethoek Ernst, although of course not in public. This came from the way in which the victims of the 20th of July 1944 were hanged on meat hooks in the execution room of the Berlin Plötzensee prison. It needs to be pointed out as well that this form of execution was not one used in Germany until the Nazi period. Nazi justice was swift. For example, here is the report for those tried on the 7th to the 8th of August 1944. Court, People's Court. Day of Judgment, 8th of August 1944. Receipt of clemency request, 8th of August 1944. Determined sentence, death, loss of civil rights. Decision of the Reich Ministry of Justice, enforcement. Day of decision, 8th of August 1944. Executed, 8th of August 1944 in Berlin. When it came to the resistance, he was especially zealous. In such cases, he considered it appropriate to demand the death not only for the accused, but also for those he or she might have known. For example, Lautz had not only applied for the death sentence by hanging of Major General Fritz Lindemann, who was part of the 20th of July 1944 coup attempt, but also those with whom he had stayed afterwards. Lindemann was seriously wounded whilst being arrested and died of his wounds before the trial could begin. Nonetheless, Erich and Elisabeth Glöden, Elisabeth Kuznitsky, Hans Sierks and Karl Marx were all sentenced to death. They were executed by guillotine at Plötzensee prison in November 1944. Their crime was to have hosted Lindemann after the coup attempt. Together with Roland Freisler, he appealed to the German judiciary on the 30th of January 1945 to confirm their devotion to the Führer. Lautz successfully sought the death of a defendant 393 times from Freisler.
Im Namen des deutschen Volkes. Der Volksgerichtshof verließ das Urteil. Im Erbenland haben an vorbereitenden Beratungen der Verräter vom 20. Juli teilgenommen. Dadurch haben sie zugleich für immer ehrlos unseren Kriegsfeinden Vorspann geleistet. Sie werden mit dem Tode bestraft.
After the war, Lautz was arrested and tried by the US Occupation Authority at Nuremberg. On the 14th of December 1947, Lautz was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment for the following crimes. Drawing up criminal legislation, for example in the drafting of the Polish and Jewish criminal law ordinance, which I will have a look at in a future video. Unjustifiably demanding the maximum penalty. Disregard for the provisions of the Code of Criminal Procedure, for example, by approving of more stringent interrogations. And I think it's clear what that means. Determining the results of a trial in advance and discussing judgments with the Senate of the People's Court. For enforcing illegal executions, including those for which the legal process was not concluded. In particular, not waiting for decisions on clemency. Responsibility for mass executions, liquidations without death sentences, transfer of inmates from penal institutions to the SS or the Gestapo. There can be no doubt that Lautz was a major criminal responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Germans. Nonetheless, on the 1st of February 1951, he was released early from Landsberg prison where war criminals were held. An attempt was made by CDU politician Eugen Gerstenmaier to put Lautz on trial for his crimes. This did not materialise as he had already been convicted by the US Occupation Court, and the court's handing over power from the US military to German civilian rule of the 26th of May 1952 and 30th of March 1955 forbade another conviction by German courts. Nonetheless, the German authorities did make an effort, but in December 1960 they had to drop all investigations against him as nothing new was turning up, and these included, amongst other things, 14 charges of aiding and abetting murder. The chief prosecutor in Lübeck, Willy Roska, justified this decision, saying that he could not get round the fact that the US military court in Nuremberg had charged him for everything possible. On release from Landsberg prison in the spring of 1951, he was given a West German welcome gift in the form of the mandatory returnee's compensation and immediate payment of his full pension as a senior Reich attorney, 1,692 marks a month. The Federal Ministry of the Interior reduced this pension to 1,342 marks in 1955 and argued that Lautz had become a senior Reich attorney through his close ties to the National Socialists. Lautz argued that he could have done nothing else, as no other position was available to him. The reduced pension was very soon increased back to 1,500 marks. At the end of 1955, the SPD parliamentary group in the Bundestag then considered it appropriate to point out to the federal government the small question that Lautz was possibly complicit in the deaths of many innocent people convicted by the People's Court. The Federal Ministry of the Interior initiated disciplinary proceedings against Lautz on the grounds that he had abused his power. 3 years later, the federal disciplinary attorney, Willy Küffner, established that Lautz had indeed abused his position as senior Reich prosecutor. On the other hand, the Federal Disciplinary Chamber, number 13 in Kiel, responsible for Schleswig-Holstein, and the body investigating his case, could not decide to completely deny Lautz state financial aid for the future. In August 1959, he was awarded 786 marks per month, of which only 600 marks were paid. Coincidentally, the widows of those executed at Lautz's demand also received 600 marks. This payment in German is called a mercy payment. Mercy. Mercy for a man who showed no mercy on his victims, who demanded a form of execution, hanging, that was not even in the penal code, and then a form of hanging which was even more barbaric than the form that the Nazis themselves had started to use. That is to say, using piano wire to do it. A man who had executions performed before a decision was made on clemency, who demanded the arrest and execution of the relatives of his victims. This man received mercy in the form of 600 marks per month. Ernst Lautz died on the 21st of January 1979 in Lübeck, with the horrific deaths of many German patriots on his conscience. If you found that of interest, I will be looking at other people involved in the National Socialist regime and what happened to them after the war, so please subscribe for that. I'm particularly interested in their post-war fate, because I think the crimes, which is my specialisation more, but what actually happened to them and how many of these criminals, such as Ernst Lautz, got away, is, I think, of particular interest. So, thank you very much for listening.
Im Namen des deutschen Volkes, Joachim Meißner wusste von Klaus Graf Stauffenberg, dass er einen Mordanschlag auf unseren Führer plante. Er hatte ihm sogar die Mörderrolle angeboten. Zwar lehnte Meißner sein Mitwirken ab, aber er unternahm nichts gegen den Verratsplan und ließ ihn dadurch weiterreifen. Eduard Brückelmeier, ein Drückeberger ganz besonderen Ausmaßes, arbeitete mit dem schon gerichteten Verrätern Graf Schwerin und Graf von der Schulenburg an der Vorbereitung des Verrats vom 20. Juli mit. Selbst entwarf er den Aufruf, der unsere Kriegsschuld anerkennen und unseren Feinden unterwerfen sollte. Wilhelm Friedrich Graf zu Lünar besprach mit anderen, darunter mit dem schon gerichteten Verräter Jäger, den Plan eines Mordanschlags auf unseren Führer und den seiner Verhaftung, um ihn zu Maßnahmen zu zwingen, die uns unseren Feinden wehrlos ausgeliefert hätten. Sie sind dadurch Verräter geworden an allem, was wir sind und wofür wir kämpfen, am Opfer unserer Krieger, an Volk, Führer und Reich. Sie sind für immer ehrlos und werden mit dem Tode bestraft. Ihr Vermögen verfällt dem Reich.